Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. Welcome to a special meeting of council on this June 21st, 2021. I'll start with roll call for members of council, please.
Michael Ternosky present.
André Brisson present.
Jamie Lauren here.
Cindy Saucier here.
Perfect. And just to confirm, our clerk is with us, Madame Camille Laflamme.
Oui, Monsieur le maire, je suis ici.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. On va aller avec l'adoption de l'agenda. Motion to approve the agenda as presented. I need a mover and a seconder, please. Moved by Councillor Ternosky, seconded by Conseil Brisson. All those in favor?
Mike Ternosky, yes.
André, oui.
Jamie, yes.
Cindy Saucier, yes.
Thank you. Item 3, disclosure of pecuniary interest. Hearing, seeing none, I'll move on to the next item. Item 4 is the development charges draft rates report FS 21-2021, and that council receives report FS 21-2021 dated June 21st, 2021, and the draft updated DC rates presentation from Hemson for information and discussion purposes, and that council provides direction to Hemson to proceed with the drafting of the background study under a municipal-wide DC approach. Monsieur Leduc, Monsieur Godin, I believe you have some introductions and moving this forward.
Oui, merci, Monsieur Maire. Good evening, members of council. So as mentioned in our staff report, our DC study is due to be updated this year. It expires in December of 2021. So back in February, we retained Hemson Consulting to conduct this review. So over the past few months, the Hemson Consulting has been working hard with the administration to move forward with this process, and right now we're at the step where we're presenting to the council and to public first draft of our DC rates. And Hemson Consulting has prepared a presentation for council to facilitate the discussion. So that being said, I'd like to welcome Andrew to our meeting tonight, and I'm going to hand over the reins to him so he can go over his presentation.
Great, thanks, Richard. Appreciate the introduction. My name is Andrew Mirabella, Senior Consultant at Hemson. We've been working quite closely with everyone at the municipality to come to the point here, as mentioned, to kind of go over some of the draft results and the rates itself in terms of your development charge background study. I have a presentation. I'll share my screen. In the meantime, I can kind of just continue to provide some overview comments here. Could everyone see the screen now?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Great. So this meeting is explicitly, as Richard mentioned, intended as an information session. It's kind of outside of the statutory process. But you know, keeping in mind that we do like to keep council and the public engaged in terms of the process itself. And there will be other opportunities from this point in which council will be required to make the decisions on. But today's session is, you know, to ask some questions, get an idea of kind of where we're coming from with the calculations, the inputs, and giving us some direction, hopefully, to kind of continue to proceed with a study, at which point it'll be circulated for public comment and obviously to inform the passage of a new bylaw sometime in the future. So in terms of our agenda today, I want to start off with maybe just a bit of a background development charges. In Russell, there's been some legislative changes to the Development Charge Act, which I'll go through. We have a little bit to talk about in terms of the development charge study process and what that means in terms of some of the key inputs into the process as it relates to your forecast, as well as your capital programs. And then those inputs itself really kind of boil down to what the draft calculated rates are for the township. And in particularly, we've also done a bit of a comparison of what your current rates are versus the calculated rates, as well as those in comparing municipalities in kind of your region, as well as some other kind of comparable size type communities. Then we'll kind of cap off with the timeline, next steps, and kind of what we have to do in order to get this process done, and where some of the key council decision points are going to be, where we are going to require your decisions in the next couple months. So just in terms of the background, so everyone's aware, your last bylaw was passed in December of 2016 and imposed DC rates for a range of services from parks and recreation to roads and water and sewer services for your serviced areas. There is a requirement to update that bylaw every 5 years. So the bylaw cannot extend past a 5-year shelf life. And in order to pass a new bylaw, council has to prepare, we have to prepare a DC background study. We have to hold a public meeting, and council has to pass that new DC bylaw. In which case, in order to continue collecting DCs, a new bylaw has to be passed of September 12th of 2021. Sorry. Okay. In terms of what are development charges, so there are fees imposed on development to finance development-related capital costs. With the idea being, as the municipality grows, new infrastructure and facilities are going to be required in order to continue to maintain service levels. The principle behind this is growth pays for growth, so that the financial burden of, servicing new development is not borne by your existing tax and rate players. So we can't use DCs for, typical capital projects, which you might think of asset management, repair and replacement components. Those are kind of ineligible for DC funding. So it really has to be directly related to new growth related infrastructure, things that expand the municipality servicing capacity. And that's one of the triggers which we see that differentiate between a growth and non-growth related project. And obviously development charges is kind of only one piece of the puzzle here. When we talk about municipal funding sources, there's direct developer contributions to pay for infrastructure that's related to a specific subdivision. But then there's also taxes and utility rates, which pay for most kind of other capital related items, but also kind of your operational expenditures in terms of revenue sources. So those are excluded from the recovery of certain projects. And what we have in here today is we're kind of zeroing in on what's DC eligible. So in terms of some of the changes that came into effect, January 1st of 2020, the Development Charge Act was amended, in which there's certain points in time in which your development charge can be established and determined at a different point, which means that at the time of certain applications, namely site plan and rezoning, the rate that's currently in effect at the time of those applications being submitted, your rate is frozen at that time for a period of 2 years following council approval. So there's a bit of a built-in phase-in and predictability in the rate schedule for those currently in the planning process. And that was done obviously by the government to provide a little bit more predictability in terms of those in the planning application process and developing to have more certainty around their costs as they go forward. The second change here is the deferral payment. So there's deferred DC payments for certain types of developments, namely rental housing, institutional, and not-for-profit housing, which the development charge as of right would be paid over a longer period of time. So 6 installments for both institutional and rental, and 21 installments for nonprofit housing. The deferral payment is only applicable to those housing. So if you're building single detached dwelling units, for-profit ones, those wouldn't be subject for the deferral. It's only for rental, institutional, nonprofit.
So just a question of clarification. So when we say rental housing, it actually has to be designated as such, right? Because, what's like, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Madame Tremblay, but I don't think we've seen much rental housing in the township. We've seen apartment buildings go up and they're renting them out, but that's not exactly what you're referring to, correct?
Correct. There's specific definitions in the act that determines what rental housing is and what institutional to meet the test of it, and it has to fall under those parameters.
Okay. And my follow-up question to that is this something that's put on title? For example, if somebody builds a property, doesn't have to pay for 4 or 5 years, but ends up selling the property beforehand, who becomes responsible for paying those DC charges?
So that's a good question. It would go to the next owner, but and if someone doesn't pay, they have the authority to go to your tax base or on the tax roll to collect for it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Great. So just to get into the study process itself, the first thing that we do is we do a development forecast, look at the amount, type, and location of development that has to be estimated. We do a calculation of what the 10-year historical service levels are. As for many of the service categories considered in this study, we can't use development charges to increase the level of service beyond the 10-year historic average immediately preceding the preparation of the background study. So there's a lot of emphasis on that particular step in the process, and staff has done a great job of preparing those service level templates and helping us fill that out for the completion of the study. We have the growth-related capital needs, which effectively looks at what all the capital costs are that were going to be required as a result of growth. And looking at each capital project on a case-by-case basis, there's a series of legislative deductions that have to be made as it relates to grants and subsidies, replacement or benefit to existing shares, any development charges, reserve funds which are available, and any shares of projects which benefit development outside the planning period are considered to be netted off the total cost. One important point here is part of the changes to the Act is that there used to be a 10% statutory discount applicable to your soft service categories, in which that 10% discount is now no longer applicable, meaning that to the extent that the project is growth related, you don't have to have a tax supported share to fund those projects. It could be completely fundable from DCs. So you have your costs eligible for recovery, and that's then delineated between a per unit charge on a residential sector and non-residential charge per square meter or per square foot of gross floor area. So kind of key input number one here is really our development forecast. Looking at what some of the trends are in terms of the township's growth over the last number of years and where we are anticipating to go to over the forecast period. So this graph really kind of tracks things back from 2006 in terms of census population, occupied households, and place of work employment. Your green line being census, gold is occupied households, and your reddish brown bar is your place of work employment. And what we see here is that kind of from 2006 up to about 2016, growth has been increasing. However, it's been at a pretty kind of stagnant, kind of upward pace, but pretty constant. We are seeing a much more uptick in activity starting in 2016 based on some of the activity that's happening on your residential sector. And also on the non-residential side, we've seen a pretty steady increase in employment as your business park kind of continues to get built out. And what we're doing from a forecast perspective post 2021 is really continuing a lot of those trends that we're seeing, certainly residentially, in terms of new unit and population growth, in which the number of new units constructed is anticipated to continue to be strong over the forthcoming planning period, much resembling a bit of an average of what we've seen over the last kind of 5 to 7 years. So perhaps not as robust annually from the last 2 to 3 years, which have seen some pretty high unit growth in kind of 300 to 400 range, but certainly well above what we've seen in terms of a historic average over the kind of the preceding period from 2006 to 2016. As we see in those years, we had averages about 110, 120 units a year, where the last couple of years have been about 360 units a year. We're looking at about 240 new units a year over the 10-year period from 2021 to 2031, resulting in population growth of about 6,600 people. And with that, I guess just to touch on the employment, it's about 1,000 employees over the 10-year period in this study. So thinking about those kind of growth outlook numbers and what we're looking at from a planning perspective, certainly that does require an amount to a series of costs, I guess, which need to be funded or considered from a capital program perspective. And when we think about the capital program, I've broken it out into two specific categories: general services and engineering services. And our general services looks at areas such as library, parks, fire, police, bylaw, and development related studies. And I'll go through the columns here. What we have on the far left is our gross program, amounts to about $64 million. And that's the total quantum of the gross program before we make any deductions as required for under the Act. And a bulk of that $64 million you'll see is directly attributable to the Parks and Recreation Program, which is then directly attributable to a new recreation center, which is planned for in the planning period. And then when we move through the actual areas here, we have our grants and subsidies, which we don't have any committed funding sources for, so we aren't assuming any grants and subsidies for the purposes of the DC calculation. Then we have the net municipal cost, which remains the same as our gross program, which is net of any grants. We have the replacement and benefit to existing share, which we have to take into consideration of any decommissioning or replacement of existing space associated with any of the projects that are occurring. And there's about $24 million worth of projects which you're considering to be a replacement or benefit to existing. And much of that is attributable to the new recreation center, which there is a potential for the arenas to be replaced with a new arena, not recognizing that there may be some retrofitting that could occur to the existing arenas, but that hasn't been embedded into this calculation at this time. Although if that is a direction by council, we can make some of those amendments and adjustments to the calculation itself. But bearing in mind, it won't actually make an impact to the DC rates at this time. It'll be considered for recovery in future studies. We have available DC reserves on hand, which would be applied towards the project cost, which we've done so. And we have the other development related share, which is the shares of projects which benefit development over the forthcoming planning period and are considered for recovery in this DC period. And the last column is what we're actually considered to be DC recovery in this planning period. So, which is about $16.8 million, and that's the far right column. So of our $64 million approximately, we have about $16.8 million identified for development charge eligible recovery. And a bulk of that 16.8 million is attributable to the Parks and Recreation category itself. But next to that, we have library and fire protection at about 1.8 million and $890,000 respectively.
Quick question.
Yes.
Sorry. You mentioned that this is regardless of grants that we might be able to get into the future. So if we were to get grants, what's the impact on DC charges at that point in time? Or is it only calculated at the following review?
So when you do get grants, you would have to, at the staff level, kind of redistribute the way the funds would be applied. But in the next DC study, we would then consider the after grants recoverable share. So we would still have to do the same calculation, but take into consideration that you did receive funding for it, and you should apply that to both the growth and non-growth portion proportionately. And the remaining would have to be, the residual would still be DC eligible. So it would be a consideration, most likely at the next DC study itself. But at this particular time, to my understanding, there's no commitment on grants that we've received, and therefore the project isn't contingent on it. So we would put it in as is.
Perfect. Thank you.
So then the next slide, we have the DC capital programs for engineering services. And this is broken into kind of two categories of services related to highway, being public works and roads, and water and sanitary sewer works. And these particular programs are obviously a little bit more heavy on costs, not from a gross program, but certainly from a DC eligible perspective. It's about $46 million in terms of gross program costs. Of that, about $5.6 million is related to other recoveries in terms of grants and subsidies, most of which is on the roads and related side, which relates to intersection improvements and cost sharing with the county. Then we have the kind of the remaining components here. So our replacement benefit to existing shares amount to about $5.1 million. DC reserves of about almost $2 million here are accounted for in the services related to highway category. And we have the post-period benefit share, which would be about $4 million, which means that there would be a share of costs that are going to be considered for recovery outside of the planning period. And that's 4.1 million. Of that, 2.5 million is on your wastewater side, which is related to a lagoon expansion that would be needed outside of, or benefiting development outside of 2031. So we've excluded that from the calculation. The remaining, the residual share is about $29 million. And that's the share that needs to be funded from development charges. And that's the DC recoverable amount. And most of that is related to your water and sanitary sewer works. Kind of almost about $22 million of that 29 is related to those two specific components. So when we think about both the engineering and the general services capital program, we're looking at about $45 million in terms of recoverable costs. And that $45 million between the 35 and the 16 million is what has to be funded from development charge, and that's what the calculation is based on. And think about that number in relation to our growth. Then we kind of see maybe what, in terms of where the rates specifically are heading, because those are two numbers in conjunction really drive the calculated rates that we're seeing. So with that, we have our maximum allowable residential township-wide rates for urban services. The pie graph on the left looks at of the total rate itself, where is the money going in terms of the distribution of your service categories. And then the table on the right looks at the calculated rates by dwelling unit type. So the first thing is for a single and semi-detached unit, the calculated rate is about just under $22,000 at $22,909. And the rates are distributed by dwelling unit type based on the occupancy patterns within those units. And the pie graph looks at, well, of that $22,900, how much of that $22,900 is going to each of those different service areas. And we see here your water, wastewater, and services related to a highway represent about 65% of your total charge. So most of which is directly related to engineering services and the infrastructure required to service development and required to service development. You have a big portion of the charge, the remaining balance is 30% for recreation services. So when we think back on those tables, your recreation, your water and your wastewater really represented the largest component of your DC eligible cost. And that's then reflected into the rate itself and where the money is going of that total rate charge itself. This is the urban services. So obviously, if you with water and wastewater, if it was a rural development, they wouldn't be paying the water and wastewater component, which would exclude that. It would be a much more reduced amount, around $11,500 for a single detached dwelling unit. So you may ask yourself, well, what does that mean from the rates that we currently have in place? The current charge is about $18,000 relative to the calculated rate of $22,909. We have an increase of about 27% on the total charge, both urban and rural, of about $4,800 per dwelling unit. You'll notice that much of the charge is directed to a couple service areas. One being your Parks and Recreation program is going up by about 50% or $2,200. Water and wastewater on a percentage basis is going up about 19-20%, which is kind of driving the total average of about just under $1,000 for water and about $900 for wastewater. And then there's some other changes on the services related to a highway component, cumulatively going up about $600, where some of the other categories are going up, but not really driving the total difference. So we see percentage-wise, bylaw enforcement is going up, but it's really only going up by $60 on the grand scheme of the total rate itself. So then the next question, well, how does that relate to some other communities kind of in and around the Prescott and Russell region and those in the Ottawa area? So the current charge for Russell Township is kind of in the mid-range here, which is kind of the pink line at $18,000. And the calculated rate would certainly bring you up the ranks a little bit, but still less than the Ottawa kind of inside and outside the Greenbelt rates, as well as the rural service rates, less than North Grenville, and currently marginally less than the draft calculated rates that are being put forward and considered for the city of Clarence Rockland, which those aren't approved yet, but they are the draft ones that are put forward to council, similar to what we've done today. And Kingston's rates again is less, but higher than some of the other communities. But I think the only thing that I want to say on this particular slide is it's important to, obviously from a council perspective, to see what other communities are charging for a single detached unit. But this calculated rate is a made for Russell Township rate, in that it does look at the growth and the capital costs and your servicing costs required to service the development at hand. So we do have to be cognizant of the cost in order it's required because of development and what needs to be paid for in order to kind of facilitate that growth that we're looking at in this planning period.
Thanks, Michael. We have a question, Councillor Larin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I just ask a question about the information from the nation? That's prior, that's current, that's not including once they're done their water project. Is that correct?
So it is correct in itself. The nations was interesting. We were having a bit of a tough time getting the much more recent water and wastewater service charges to them. So it does include it, but we feel that it might be understated. And certainly when they update it with all the new water projects, that would change with their new bylaw update. Correct.
Okay. Is there a way to have an asterisk there somewhere, just like you did with Smith Falls? Just sure. Because it'd be interesting to know, because we have people on both sides of the Limoges border. Okay. And we just want to make sure that they see the comparison, that the comparison isn't apples to apples today, because we've already done our water project, they haven't. So
got it. Okay.
That's
fair. No problem. All right. So then moving along onto the non-residential side, kind of the same story in terms of the graph and the calculated rates. The pie graph looks at the distribution of the charges on a percentage basis by service area. the calculated rates. I've represented them here both in a square meter and square foot basis for illustrative purposes. On a square meter basis, serviced is about $58.67 per square meter. Unserviced is about $14.33, which relate to about $5.45 per square foot serviced and $1.33 per square foot unserviced. So no change to the calculation. It's just the way the charge is illustrated for comparison purposes. So I guess with that, in terms of your comparison of current versus calculated, the charge itself for the non-residential sector is going up 13%, so $6.79 per square meter from the current rate in force, or 63 cents per square foot. One thing I will want to know with this graph, there's a bit of a difference in methodology in the way we think about non-residential development charges, in the way in which your current rates are based on. So you will see for library and parks and recreation, there is a current charge per square meter for it. And then you'll see in the calculated rate that there's no charge for it. And it's within our kind of belief in terms of the needs for service for those particular categories is actually being driven by residential development and not non-residential development. So we don't actually have a charge for it because the entire service category and the cost related to those service areas is being borne by the residential sector and not the non-residential sector. So there's a bit of a change in the difference of charge for those two specific categories. But for the other categories, the increase is largely being driven directly by your water, wastewater, and your kind of services related to a highway type service categories of roads and public works too. So just in terms of some of the comparisons here for the non-residential development charges for commercial per square meter, your current charge is kind of on the lower end of the spectrum, and after these particular rates are if they were to be implemented, the fully calculated would put you on the kind of in a very similar position relative to some of the other communities, much less than Clarence, Rockland, and Kingston and Ottawa, and North Grenville in terms of serviced areas itself. So I think I've talked a little bit about, as we're going through kind of what's really attributing to the rate increase here. We see it as kind of a bit of a fourfold type competing factors. One, there's just been a more robust departmental inventories, and there's also increased growth in period, which is what's attributing to, from a technical perspective, higher funding envelopes, which means that our service levels are based on the average is increased, and our valuations have increased, which means there's more latitude to fund more capital in the forthcoming planning period. And there's also attributable projects which need to be funded, which does relate to an increase in DC services or DC charges for some of those areas, such as recreation and library. We've seen increases in the rates. And what we're seeing here on the second bullet point is just there's also an increase in the general service projects, and there's some higher project costs in there. So we have the new rec center and expansion of library space, which is incorporated, which is driving some of the needs there. The third point, we have a roads and related program, which is a bit more robust than the previous study. We have more intersection improvements based on new traffic demands and road requirements. And that's all being kind of supported by some of the studies that have currently been undertaken. And then the fourth one, we have recovery of negative reserve fund balances and existing debt. And that's particularly the case in your water and your wastewater programs, where there's negative reserve funds, and there's also debt on some of those systems associated with the expansions that have recently occurred or have occurred in the past, and we're continuing to recover for them over the planning period. So from an implementation option standpoint and some of the policy considerations, there's a couple of things that you should know about now and kind of start to consider. The first one being council really has the authority to implement kind of a range of rates here, I guess you could say. And the first one being you can implement the maximum allowable rate or a DC rate that's lower than the maximum allowable rate calculated. Council does not have the authority to put in a rate that's higher than what's been identified in the background study. And that's not just on a cumulative basis, but even on a service area by service area basis.
Just to confirm, so the rates that we're being shown in the previous slides, that's the maximum?
Those are the maximum calculated based on the growth in the projects that we have, correct.
Thank you.
The development charges, they can be phased in over the life of a bylaw. I do caution, with extreme caution, that the recent changes to the DC Act of Section 26 and 21, 1 and 2, as it relates to the DC rate freeze and the deferrals, there's already effectively a built-in phase-in mechanism with that. So we're definitely encouraging municipalities to consider, reconsider if they are going to be looking to phase in the rates, that they consider that really in the context of those recent legislative changes, because of those changes, you may implement the phase-in, but then that phase-in may extend actually longer than what your bylaw would allow for. In that your phase-in would be 1 year, and then you would have to extend it out for, keep it frozen for 2 years after that. So it could be even after your bylaw expires, you would be implementing a phased-in rate. So there's a lot of administrative process, but there's also some financial implications associated with that too. And then obviously any kind of revenue loss associated with reducing the rates or phasing them in or deferring them, that lost revenue has to be made up from other sources, which is namely your property taxes and utility rates. So, and any foregone DC revenue cannot be made up by way of higher GCs. So we can't also say we want to discount or exempt non-residential development and put the burden on residential development. That would be an exemption, and that has to be funded from non-DC sources. So it can't be made up by other service categories. So with that, just in terms of our next steps, and this is my last slide, I think we are looking to go ahead and prepare a DC background study with the services that are being considered effectively on a municipal-wide basis and township-wide basis as we've calculated. Once we've kind of prepared that background study, it will be circulated for public consultation, and a background study has to be made 60 days in advance of any bylaw passage. So we are looking to do that sooner rather than later, so that we can have the background study out kind of in the summer or fall. So a new bylaw can be considered in November of 2021, which is in advance of your existing bylaw expiring in December. During that time period, once the background study is out, we will hold any developer consultation, and there will have to be a statutory public meeting at council. And that bylaw and background study can obviously be refined based on the commentary and input received from both council and the public. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any other questions we may have.
Just one quick question on this slide. Is there an appeal process? For example, members of the public or developers don't like the decision of council. Is there an appeal process for them?
Yes, so there is a 40-day appeal period. Once the bylaw is passed, they can appeal it, the rates in the bylaw at that time.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Tarnowski.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'd like to go to the summary of DC capital program, the $64 million page.
Mm-hmm.
I understand everything. The column that says other development related, it's got a little star next to it. Can you just explain that column for me, please?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the other development related, it relates to mostly the shares of projects that are benefit development and they are growth related, but exceed the maximum allowable funding envelope. So they have to be considered from development charges outside the planning period. And as a precursor to that, we've changing some of the language in our studies to other development related, because in a technical perspective, there's the whole world of, if you've been following kind of the Bill 108 changes on community benefits charges and development charges, in that if the township does move forward to implement a community benefits charge, there can be overlap with the community benefits charged with development charges, in which they can still be used in tandem together, but they can't be used to fund the same capital costs. So there's a very specific reason that we're showing it as other development related, because community benefits charges are applied to growth related projects, and it would be applied to that middle column, not the column that's DC eligible for recovery. But at this time, the CBC and the regime is only on high density type development. So if there is a need for the municipality to go down that route, and if high density developments become more common practice, they may consider that. So we don't want to put we really don't want to put the township put their backs against the wall. If they want to decide to do that in the next 5 years, they can do that with this study based on some of the refined language. So that's a long-winded answer to probably a not technical question, but there's some technicalities to it, I guess.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions, members of council? Seeing none, I do have, I'm not sure if you're controlling the screen for this one, but Schedule B was the, that we had in our report, was development-related capital program.
Okay.
And that was just in relation to the projects we're looking at, and there was just some projects or some comments, I guess, that I wanted to highlight. So in regards to Parks and Recreation, I'm not sure if staff has looked at this or it was part of the study, but it's quite possible that with the new complex, that we're going to have some existing buildings that might need refurbishing, might become a different type of use that might be related to growth. So I'm not sure if that's something we want to look at. One thing I did notice as well is that I didn't see anything for expansion of daycare services. And when I think of the growth we're seeing in our community, the daycare services is something that we already have a shortage of spaces. And I think there's a huge demand, and it'll only continue to be a huge demand. So I'm not sure if we have anything in relation to that. And I think, no, one more. I guess this is probably more operational side as needed. I'm not sure if we wanted to look at it from a global perspective, but I know we have a report at our following meeting about pedestrian safety. And because of the increased traffic in the township, we're looking at pedestrian safety, improving things. So I'm not sure if there's something to look at it from the long term for that as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I can comment on a couple of these points here. So in terms of the first one on the existing buildings, we can definitely take that back with staff. The working assumption in the capital program right now is that there'd be a new facility constructed with 3 arenas, and 2 of which at the township's existing arenas would be decommissioned. So it'd only be one net new arena.
Right.
With that said, if your existing arenas get repurposed for something else, meaning that, hey, we would be doing these, we would need the expansion of some other space in the event we didn't build this recreation complex, we would have to build something else. That's why we're repurposing these arenas. We could consider those to be growth related,
right?
And kind of effectively remove that BTE share that we're showing. The only thing I guess I'll mention with that is from a calculation perspective, we are at the ceiling in terms of what we can fund based on the historic average. So it would be considered post-period benefit.
Okay.
But if that is the intention of council, then we can definitely make the change from a capital. So at least it's disclosed the way you intend to undertake the works.
Okay. No, I know council hasn't taken position yet, but I know we're thinking long term.
Okay.
And, in our complex, we had talked about a potential theater, a place for concerts, that kind of stuff. And, that would be an option for one of the arenas turning into that kind of venue. So I just want to throw out there and make sure that, if we're planning on looking at it down the road, then we might want to make note of it at some point in time.
So just on that, though, we have to also be careful. So cultural services are ineligible for funding. So things such as theaters and event venues are kind of excluded for DC recovery. So if you were to do one of the arenas in that route, we would still have to account for a BT on it. But if the other one was used for, let's say, programming space or something along those lines that's recreation related, then it could be considered for DCs.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
And in regards to daycares, any thoughts on that one?
We have to go back with staff to see if there's any capital. Like for us to have any charge for it, there has to be capital costs associated with it. So we just have to be cognizant of that. Okay. And then on the pedestrian safety measures, we've done in other communities, put in pedestrian safety measures as a provisionary item potentially, but recognizing that those costs do also benefit. It's arising from growth, but it's also arising from just travel demands with your existing population. So we may have to recognize that in terms of a BT share, but let us take that back with staff and the engineering department, and we can consider what those might look like in the context of specific projects, or if there's a provision item that we can do.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Tarnowski.
Sorry, I'm the noob on council this time around, so I have one other question that might have been covered through a previous one of these, but post-period benefit sounds to me like it's because the asset has value for a longer period than up to 2031. Is that why it's accounted for as post-period benefit? Like, plus we can't cover it, so are we going to be able to recover some of that value after 2031?
So through the mayor, in a development charge context, we think of it as this asset being able to service development over a longer term planning horizon, not necessarily that the asset has value in terms of a useful life perspective from an asset management perspective, more so that, if we're, extending our water capacity, but the capacity is available to service up to 2031, but it also being built to service development beyond 2031, we would consider that capacity beyond 2031 as the post-period share and not the in-period share.
Okay.
That's a simple example.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions, members of council? Conseil Brisson?
Yeah, it was just at it's the table 2, because whenever we're talking about development charge, it's because of growth. But whenever you arrive at 2.1 for road and related infrastructure, those are roads that are already there, that are just done to be repaired. I know the intersection and sidewalk, it's new because there's more traffic, but that's why I wanted to know, are those the road allowed in the development charge since they're older road?
So through the mayor, the road works that are being done, a lot of them are being done also to increase because of the increased traffic volumes, but we've also accounted for what you see as a benefit to existing share. So although the project is in there, only 50% of the work is actually being attributable to to DCs. The other 50% is being attributable to your existing population, which would have to be funded from non-DC sources. So there is a balance between growth and non-growth, in particular with the roads and related infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. D'autres questions, other questions? Anything to add from staff at all? Monsieur Leduc?
Mr. Mayor, members of council, I guess staff would like to know, I guess, your reaction to what's proposed in the rates here. I know you've asked a few more questions to include more. So does that mean council is willing to entertain a higher value of proposed DC rates? Or you're considering what's their fare right now? Or so I guess so that we can go back and work with the consultant.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Leduc. From my perspective, I think it's fair what's there now in comparison. We're not on the high end, we're not on the low end. We have to think long term as well. In regards to some of the projects, if there's an increase because of some other projects, do we trim back on other projects, in the planification? But I'm comfortable with what is being presented. I don't know, members of council, any thoughts on that? Councillor Tarnowski?
So with the growth that we're experiencing now, I think it only stands to reason that we have a fair bit of infrastructure that's associated with that growth, and with the future growth expected to be at this high level, I think it only makes sense. I'm not uncomfortable with where we're at right now, to the point where even if it was a bit higher, I would still be okay.
Okay, thank you. Other members of council, questions, comments? Councillor Laray?
Yeah, do we know when this would be shown to the development community to get their comments on it?
So through the mayor, I think just generally from a legislative process perspective, they would at minimum see it at the statutory public meeting, and obviously formally through a similar presentation like this, they would obviously get that information from the release of the background study. We do likely or will engage the development community in advance of a public meeting. We'll have to determine if that's necessary with staff, but In other communities, we've done so, again, outside the statutory process. But we wanted to get council's input first before we did any developer consultation. So that was kind of kickstarting that process here today. And I think Richard and Sean and I will take that back and figure out a way to communicate this information with them.
Yeah, I mean, we just got to remember, right? We're in partnership with them as well on all of this stuff. So it'd be good to get their input. I'm not saying I'm not in favor of the amounts. I just like to hear what their comments are as well. And we got to make sure that we're doing everything for the right reasons. And if it makes sense, then we absolutely move forward. So I have no problems with that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Councillor Lorrain. Other thoughts, comments? If there's none, thank you very much, Andrew. Monsieur Godin, t'avais-tu quelque chose à ajouter?
Merci, Monsieur Mayor. No, just to say, thanks everybody I appreciate council's input and questions, and thanks again, Andrew, very much for participating tonight. I think we have a good idea where we're going, and with your comments that we received, we're going to go back to the drawing table to make those few adjustments. But that's pretty much it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Monsieur Godin. If there's no further comments from staff or council, we'll move on in the agenda. Item 5, question period on the meeting of the day. I don't believe we have any questions. No questions. So we'll move on to the next one, which is resolutions. Motion that council approves all recommendations listed on the agenda under item 4, reports from departments and council's committees. I need a mover and a seconder, please. Moved by Councillor Lorrain, second by Councillor Tarnowski. Questions? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote.
Mike Tarnowski, yes.
André, oui.
Jamie, yes.
Sorry.
Cindy's in favor?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Very
Thank you very
delayed tonight.
All right, so the motion is carried. Move on to confirming bylaw, that bylaw 2021-061, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the Council of the Corporation and Township of Russell at a special council meeting held on June 21st, 2021, be read a first, second, and third time and passed. I need a mover and a seconder, please. Moved by Conseiller Brisson, seconded by Councillor Tarnowski. All those call for the vote.
Mike Tarnowski, yes.
André, oui.
Jamie, yes.
Cindy Sosa, yes.
Perfect. Confirming bylaw is approved. Our next meeting, we have our regular council meeting that starts in 10 minutes. So we'll see you there, and we are adjourned at 5:48 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.